Well, Laura, summer is here, and you know what that means? It's time to find a new podcast to binge. I love the summertime. That's when I find the best things that we all become obsessed about.
I know, I'm super excited because there's lots of great podcasts coming out. And you know what? There's a fantastic new podcast called The Wonderland-Murders, and it's from Hollywood and Crime.
That's right. Those are the same people who brought us the Young Charlie series that chronicled the evolution of Charles Manson from troubled kid to infamous criminal. And at this time, Hollywood and Crime is taking on the Wonderland-Murders. Do you want to tell people what that case was all about?
This is a very different type of case, isn't it, from Young Charlie? You know, I did a little bit of research on this case because I hadn't really heard much about it. And it happened in the Hollywood Hills in Laurel Canyon. And it really is a very brutal murder, well, four murders, in fact. And it happened on July the 1st, 1981. Four bodies were found brutally murdered inside a house on Wonderland Avenue. And actually, one victim did survive it. But the LAPD detectives who attended the scene said it was a bloodier and more horrifying scene than the Manson family murders. I mean, it sounds absolutely horrific, and it's actually still unsolved, Lisa.
If you want to watch a really great movie about this case, you can get the movie called Wonderland, and I think it came out in 2003. It stars Val Kilmer, Kate Bosworth, and an unrecognizable Christina Applegate, who does just an amazing job. And the whole cast, I mean, it's a who's who. It's a great movie. So, you know, if you watch that along with listening to the podcast, I think you'll get a really great visual of what, you know, this specific time in LA, the 70s, this sort of sex and drugs and rock and roll and all kinds of crazy things happening there. And I just find it a really fascinating time in the city's history.
The other interesting thing about the case is that it's the first time in US history that a video walkthrough was used at the time of trial as evidence. So there's some really interesting firsts as well in terms of the case. So for our listeners, those who want to hear the first two episodes right now, you can search for the Wonderland-Murders on Apple Podcasts.
And if you want to hear the first 6 episodes before anybody else, head over to Wondery.com/plus. That's WONDERY.com/PLUS.
And the other thing I just want to mention, Lisa, is the victims' names, because this is a case, again, where people don't talk about the victims. So I'm just going to mention their names, which was Ron Launius, Billy Deverell, Joy Miller, and Barbara Richardson. And they all died from extensive blunt force trauma. But Ron Launius' wife, Susan, she actually survived with horrific injuries, but she still did survive. And because we're victim-centric, you know, in this case, it's still unsolved. So I think it's going to be fascinating to listen to the podcast. And so while you're searching for the Wonderland-Murders, here's a preview of the first episode that opens with the discovery of the 4 bodies.
Detective Lang arrived at the Wonderland address before Souza, who was fighting traffic on Laurel Canyon Boulevard. It was an estimated 12 hours after the murders. The block was lined with camera trucks as news teams pressed to get information from officers. Police and news helicopters buzzed overhead. The house was a sprawling white split level with 2 balconies in front. Unlike most of the residences on the block, it was in disrepair. The paint was chipped and weeds peeked through cracks in the driveway. Lang noticed the gated stairway leading to the entrance of the 3-story house. The deadbolt lock was electronically controlled from inside. Responding officers had found 2 pit bulls running free in the yard. Lang entered the house, followed by an LAPD cameraman to document the scene. The air was oppressive. The windows were shut, and the hot LA evening intensified the stench of blood and death. They had to step carefully to avoid the pools of blood on the floor. The first body they encountered was a woman's. She was lying on her side between a sofa and coffee table. Her head had been crushed by repeated blows, her face a tangle of gore and hair. Lang noticed the sprays of blood on the walls reaching up to the ceiling, apparently cast off as someone raised and brought down the weapon repeatedly. Lang looked around at the drug paraphernalia, baggies and film canisters, traces of white powder, hypodermic needles, freebasing pipes. The dead woman appeared to have no defensive wounds. The initial blow had probably landed while she was sleeping on the sofa. The pattern of blood on the lower walls indicated she'd been struck again and again after falling to the floor, likely dead or unconscious. The medical examiner would later find her body bore tattoos of a butterfly, a mushroom, a flower, Minnie Mouse. Lang moved slowly through the residence, trying to piece together what had happened. Experience told him this was an act of rage. Blood sprays and transfers were everywhere, creating a tapestry of carnage and footprints on the pillars, on the ceiling. Throughout the house, he saw empty drawers, piles of clothes haphazardly flung about. It was impossible to know yet whether the looting indicated a search for some particular valuable or was simply an opportunistic byproduct of the slaughter. The detective walked down a hall and entered a rear bedroom. A male victim lay on the bed, his head crushed by repeated blows. Bits of skull and brain reached up to the ceiling. Several hypodermics were lying around. Blood formed a large stain on the wall near where the only survivor, a woman, had been found and evacuated by an EMS team. She had suffered massive brain trauma. Somehow a fragment of her skull had been wedged in such a way as to prevent her bleeding to death. The tip of one of her fingers had been severed, probably as she attempted to ward off the blows. Doctors didn't know if she would make it through the night. In a second-floor bedroom, Lang saw two more bodies, both with their heads bashed in. A male victim was partially propped against a TV stand. The television was still on. Blood on the nearby curtains extended up to the ceiling. A woman lay on her back across the bed, her legs hanging over the edge. Her head had been crushed flat to the eyebrows. A dribble of gray brain matter extruded from her nose down to her lips. A hammer lay at the edge of the bed. Several of the police officers remarked that the scene was the worst they'd ever witnessed, more grisly even than the Manson slayings a dozen years earlier. As he surveyed the carnage, there was no doubt in Tom Lang's mind. This killing was meant to send a message. No one knew yet who'd sent it or why, but this was personal. It would be 24 hours before the house would be fully canvassed and the bodies could be removed. When officers finished dusting for prints, they would find one that would prove to have particular significance: a palm print on the bed rail above the body of one of the victims.
That was just a preview of the Wonderland-Murders. To hear the rest of this episode, search for the Wonderland-Murders on Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening to this, or find a link in the episode notes. If you want to hear the entire series ad-free before anyone else, head to Wondery.com/plus. That's WONDERY.com/PLUS.